All right, let me show you what happens when we apply floats to multiple objects. First of all, and again, this almost goes without saying, but if I have a group of objects, like a group of 4 divs, which I happen to have here inside my code, which is handy, and there's no floating happening at all on these 4 objects, then inside the browser, they are rendered as a column of objects. Because a div is a block level element, each of these guys appears on their own line. That's how that works. But as soon as I start messing around with floats, that's where things change. So check this out. I'm going to go back to my code here. The first div, my yellow rectangle, I'm going to go and float this guy to the left, just like that. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to apply the same property and value to my other divs. So in other words, I'm going to take all 4 divs and I'm going to float them all to the left, and we're going to see what happens here. So give me a moment here. I'm just going to paste this in, save this up, and then back over to the browser and refresh. And there we go. Now what happens is all 4 objects are now floating in a horizontal row. And of course, the content that appears below the divs wraps around. We've seen this behavior a number of times. Now let me explain exactly what's happening here. So again, an object that's floating on the left is moved to the extreme left-hand side of the browser window. That's my yellow object. And then any objects that appear below this floating object simply wrap around. As we saw, the blue div actually got tucked up underneath the yellow div. But because I've applied a float to the blue div as well, this guy wraps up around beside the yellow div. And then there's a float on the red guy as well, so he wraps up. And then there's a float on the green div, so he's wrapping up as well. And then, of course, once again, the content that appears below wraps around the remaining space, assuming there is extra horizontal space here to accommodate any extra content. Okay, so that's how that works. So objects floating on the left all get crammed over onto the left-hand side of the screen. What happens if we have a right float instead? Well, let's go and see what happens. I'm going to change all my lefts to rights. And then what we'll do is we'll go and check out the result inside our browser. So give me a second here. There we go. Save that up, refresh. And essentially we get the same thing. It's almost like a mirror image, the complete opposite. So now the first object is the first guy who's floating way over on the extreme right, then blue, then red, then green. And then any extra content now wraps up or floats up around the left-hand side. You might want to experiment a little bit with this here. Now, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm actually going to hit my undo a bunch of times to go all the way back to left floating. And, of course, that brings me all the way back here. Now, I want to show you what happens if there isn't enough space horizontally on the page to accommodate all of my content. So, in other words, what would happen if I took the widths of 1 or 2 or maybe all of my divs and increased that width value? What would happen to the remaining content? Well, let's check this out. I'm going to flip back to my code. I'm actually going to go and look for my red div. There he is right there. And I'm going to go and change his width. I'm going to change his width to, I'm going to try 800 pixels. So he's going to be super wide here. I'll save up my code and refresh. There we go, something like that. So this might be a little much to wrap the old noodle around at first, but it actually makes sense when you stop and think of it. But if I have an object that's accommodating or occupying the horizontal space, any objects that appear after that guy simply wrap down to the next available line. Why? Because that's where the next available space is, right? Or I could come along and I could maybe do something like this. Let me go back to where I started here. What if the blue div had a crazy amount of width on him? Maybe, let's say 1,000 pixels. Will that be enough? Save and refresh. There we go. That was enough. So now this blue div is occupying all of this horizontal space, but the red guy and the green guy still have floats on them. So they're forced down to the next available line, the next available piece of space, but they're still floating. He's still appearing on the extreme left-hand side. Same with the green guy as well. And then once again, all of the content below that simply wraps. Okay, so that's how it works when we're working with floats on multiple objects.